Þá ása Odin kom á Norðurland og með honum Díar. Það sagt með sannindum að þeir hófu og kendu íþróttir þær. Menn hafa lengi síðan með farið. Hi and welcome to Viking Superpowers. In this episode we're going to carry on with my last video about ÍÞROTTÍR, that Old Norse word for the special skills that were brought to the north by Odin and his Díar, which means his specially trained priests or acolytes or agents. And I want to start off with just reading a little bit out of my book Viking Superpowers, Way of Asgard. And on page 26, I'm quoting from a book called When They Severed Earth from Sky, How the Human Mind Shapes Myth, by Elizabeth Whalen Barber and Paul T. Barber from the Princeton University. And they said, "We have argued that myths were not intended as fiction in our sense, but as carriers of important information about real events and observations. We have also given much evidence that, contrary to prevailing belief today, this information can sometimes survive intact for thousands of years." And that's a very profound thing to say. The essence of that is that they're saying we can prove that myths, which are often considered just fancies, just fairy stories, just primitive god stories, were not intended as fiction in the sense that we think of it. That the people who wrote and passed on these myths verbally and by being written down and carved into objects and artifacts, they intended to pass on information about real events and observations. It's also been shown, and this is what I say regarding the Viking myths, that this information can survive intact for thousands of years. And part of my research, especially when I went to Scandinavia, and when I go back again absolutely, is to look at Bronze Age rock carvings from Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, to look at artifacts from the Bronze Age, and of course things in the Viking Age and the Vendel Age, which was before that. But essentially there's a whole incredible story waiting to be interpreted that's passed across 3,000 years to the Viking Age and 4,000 years to our time. And I do believe there's a lot of information that's way older than that. And as scholars are discovering around the world, innovative thinkers are starting to realise that the Younger Dryas period, around about 12,000 years ago, appears to have been a real event that wiped out civilization, and that there is still evidence of that past civilization, and there's still strong evidence of rebuilding after that time. And in the stories of the world, particularly in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Mesopotamian ancient texts of peoples like the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Sumerians, these ancient myths preserve information that a lot of modern scholars are starting to accept as things that were real, pointing to actual human memories that have been preserved for thousands and thousands of years. I also quote this time on page 27 that Professor Benjamin B. Olshan, Professor of Philosophy, the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Arts in Philadelphia, wrote in his book, a great book which you should try and get, titled Lost Knowledge, the Concept of Vanished Technologies and Other Human Histories. And he wrote, it examines the idea of lost knowledge reaching back to a period between myth and history. It investigates a peculiar idea found in a number of early texts that there were civilizations with knowledge of sophisticated technologies, such as mechanical flight and the transmission of images. So we're talking television here. There is also an examination of why concepts of a vanished golden age were prevalent in so many cultures. So in my book, I also talk about the great migration of the Aesir, which Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic chieftain and historian who saved all these myths for us in the early 1200s in Iceland, he writes that these people left Anatolia, that's in the area of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, not that far from ancient Sumeria, from not that far north of Babylon, the area where the Bible tells us Noah's Ark landed on Mount Ararat, where the human race restarted after the Great Flood. I talk about Snorri's story that these people crossed overland, which sort of to me sounds like flying, but it could have been just moving in some kind of transport. But it says that they moved to the north en masse. They left their old place still there, which they called Old Asgard, and they were seen as so wonderful by everybody that met them on the way up to the north that they were considered gods. So different translations say that they showed glories, amazing glories, amazing beauty. And I, of course, believe that a lot of what people saw was high technology, technology probably more advanced than what we have now. In my video today, I'm going to look at chapter 7 in Heimskringla, which I read to you last time. This wonderful book, Heimskringla, it's volume 1 by Snorri Sturluson from the Íslensk Fornrit series, which you can see there behind me. All the collection of the Icelandic sagas written in the old language, Old Norse, which is thousands of years old. And what I sort of want to put to you is that I consider that Odin and these advanced peoples had two kinds of ÍÞROTTÍR, two kinds of skills, and I think this absolutely applies to this in this time we're living in now. There is high technology skills, which to any people from the past, even not so long ago for us, would have seen as magic, would have seen as totally inexplicable, therefore must be magic, whatever that word means, things that bamboozle, amaze, seem to break the laws of physics and nature. And there's also super paranormal skills. That's why I call my project Viking Superpowers, because I believe there's two types of superpowers going on in these ancient stories. There's technological superpowers, there's paranormal, personal, human, spiritual ability superpowers, what the ancient yogis call siddhis. That's human abilities beyond the normal that develop from the practice of meditation, from yogic practices and other practices. And this is something I'll be making videos about in the near future, about how to develop our own ÍÞROTTÍR. But my point is that I think these ancient myths are historical records, have been glossed over as just fairy tales for a long, long time. But now, finally, in this time, as AI keeps developing, as artificial intelligence is looming as a potential self-aware superconsciousness, which is going to change everything, we humans need to discover what the ancients were telling us. I think they were telling us clearly that as our own technology develops to the sort of level that we see in these ancient myths, we also need to match that with our organic human abilities, abilities that sometimes people talk about sort of mimicking with brain implants, connections to machines, connection to the World Wide Web. But to me, that's a sort of a wheelchair. It's not really the same thing. We need to develop what we've always had, and what possibly is what makes us so attractive to these different species and groups that have been here since the beginning of recorded history and probably longer, is that we not only have abilities like telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, being able to see the future, get messages of guidance that help us in situations that could be dangerous, messages of danger, Will Robinson danger, messages of ways to get finances or money or get ahead or learn things. We also have this connection to what I call God. That's another video, but the Vikings definitely worshipped these Aesir as gods. But within the stories and the myths, I've found this dichotomy where you can clearly see Snorri saying, look, yes, we've worshipped these beings as gods, but actually who they were was really advanced people who'd settled in Asia. He doesn't say how long, but he says that they're mortals, not humans, but there's some greater being that created the world, that created all the creatures, and he calls that the All-Father. And to me, people have said, oh, well, that's just a rip-off of the Christian idea, but many scholars, which I will talk about, have said, no, it's before that, it's before Christianity, and I think it makes a heck of a lot of sense. And there's just all sorts of other things we have access to. In my own personal case, had a near-death experience when I was 22, and I experienced what it's like on the other side of death, what it's like to come back and how it affects you, and millions of people have had this experience, and for quite a few decades people have been coming out, writing their own books, telling their stories to others. So we're really learning a lot about what the nature of life itself is. I see it as us as eternal beings living adventures in a great long series, but we never actually die. Our body dies, and our body changes anyway. It's aging and changing all the time, but we have a lot of powers. We have inexplicable things, and if you saw my last video about the whistleblower Matthew Brown, I hope you found that an incredible video, because I found it incredible researching it and making the video. But he says explicitly that we've been fed a false science for a long time, and he doesn't go right into it, but he's obviously saying a false science that says there isn't these beings here, that this is all just fantasy, and people who say that they've had these experiences are lying, or they're crackpots, or they're being paid by somebody. It is also indicating that all these paranormal abilities of humans, which are stridently denied, if you go and look at TED, which I used to admire, TED Talks, they're stridently anti-human psychic abilities and unusual powers. They're very anti it. Wikipedia is sort of, this whole area is run by this mob called guerrilla skeptics of Wikipedia, who just one day will find out that they're wrong. And there's groups like that all over the place, but it's not just people like that on the grassroots level. There's a big conspiracy, I guess you have to call it that, to keep us dumb. So what I'm saying is, the old stories are telling us the opposite. They're saying not only did Odin and these other great beings have these abilities and develop these abilities to an extremely high level, but they taught humans, and they taught people, and Snorri says that these ÍÞROTTÍR were being practiced right up to his time. 200 years after the official Christianization of Iceland, he was saying there's still people practicing this stuff. That's what I find it really exciting, that these sagas, hardly anybody except Icelanders ever read them in the original, because it's pretty tough. But it's a whole field to be discovered, retranslating and seeing what we're really being told. So let's get back on to Heimskringla, chapter 7. I'll read you a little bit in Norse just to give you the flavour of it, and then I'll read you the English translation and we'll have a bit of a chat about that. So this is chapter 7, and you can see Heims Kringle up the top. And one of the great things about these books, they have a marvellous modern Icelandic set of notes for most things, and sometimes that's the most challenging thing, is reading that Icelandic. But ChatGPT is a great help. It's really good with Icelandic. So chapter 7 starts off, Odin skipti homum, lá þá bukkurinn sem sofinn eða dóður, en hann var þá fugl eða dýr, fiskur eða ormur, og fór á eini svipstund á fjarlæg lond at sínum orundum eða annara manna. It's a beautiful language. So, turning to the English, Odin, that's Odin, changed shapes. Or skipti homum, which means he skipped or shipped from one body to another. It's so cool. Just a little, what would you call it? A Norse trivia is that most verbs with a K, well, actually a lot of nouns too, if for an English speaker, if we change the K to a H, often you can tell what it is, because the word's almost the same as English. It's just that they use a K, we use a H, so it's a softer sound. Then his body, his trunk, lay as if it was asleep or dead, while he, Odin, was a bird or an animal, a fish or a snake, and travelled in an instant to distant lands on his own or other people's business. He also knew how to put out fire. Listen to all these things, it's pretty far out. Calm the sea, or turn the winds in any direction he wished, with words alone. And he owned a ship called Skithblathnir, on which he sailed over high seas, but it could be folded together like a cloth. And I talk a lot about that in my book, Viking Superpowers Way of Asgard. I've got my theories on how that ship could be possible, because it sounds pretty impossible. Folding a ship up like a hanky, sticking it in your pocket. Odin kept Mimir's head by him, and it told him much news from other worlds. And Mimir, I believe, is an AI, a robot with an AI soul. Also in my book I talk a lot about him and another AI called Kvasir, Kvasi with a /R, who was an AI robotic person who was, created by the Vanir, the opponents and later the allies of the Aesir. So this Mimir told Odin news from other worlds, and the word Heim, which we translate as world, it sort of means home, and it could easily be translated as home world. And I think of it as Mimir is telling him information not only about things that are going on the Earth, but other planets, probably other solar systems, where the Aesir and the other people involved had colonies, had people living there. So this is pretty cool. It's very, very sci-fi. It's like most sci-fi, if you pitch it a couple of 100 years from now, say Star Trek, there's all these home worlds and humans are all over the galaxy. So this is pretty much, I think, a story, a memory of when it was like that. For some reason we got shut down and we've been told there's nobody else. Maybe we'll find a microbe somewhere under a rock in Mars if we're lucky, but there's nobody else out there. I don't buy that in the slightest. Now we get into some far out abilities that he had. It says, sometimes he, Odin, awakened the dead from the earth, or sat himself under hanged men. Because of this, he was called Droga, which means the Lord of the Droga, which is a difficult to translate word. It sort of means the undead, or those who get brought back to life. And I feel a bit like one of them, considering that I was dead and I was brought back to life back when I was 22, and felt like a different person when I came back. He was also called Hungadrotin, which means Lord of the Hanged People. So they're both about contacting the other side, about death experiences where people are brought back from death. A very interesting subject. It says he had 2 ravens which he had trained to speak. They flew over distant countries and told him much news. So they could just be 2 great big black ravens. They're amazing creatures, really intelligent, and they can speak and sing. But once again, I think this is these ravens, Hugin and Munin, mean thought and memory, and I consider them to be robotic flying information gathering craft. If you needed 2 birds to get you information from other countries, it would take a fair while for them to get there and come back. I think this is high tech. From these things he became extremely wise, meaning not only information he got from the birds, information that he got from Mimir's head, and later, I think Kvasir was his mate and was also feeding him information, but also that he talked to the dead. He talked to the Droga and the Hunger. And that's a very interesting subject. Yes, the dead do talk to us. And I've had a couple of interesting experiences in that line in recent years, and I'll tell you about them too. Now, this next bit's fascinating. All these skills, these ÍÞROTTÍR, he taught, along with runes, that's that special writing we all know, the Viking writing, and those songs that are called Galdrar. Now, this word means chanting. A person who sings paranormal abilities is called a Galdra Mother. The women are called Galdra Kona. So this Galdra is an indication of a connection with the unconscious mind, because when we chant and sing, it can either be very conscious mind or it can go over to the other mind, which I consider the rear brain, where we connect to the universe. It's, I believe, the rear brain is the nexus for the powers. And if you know anything about chakras, you know that there's the crown chakra just behind and above your head, which also connects you to everything and connects you to, the Great One. Not what Snorri actually wrote. He just wrote Galdra, but translators through the centuries have generally either been Christian priests, ministers, reverends, the sort of people that in the past were the scholars, or heavily influenced by Christianity or by these past writers. So they tended to treat this stuff as bad, right? This is not Christian, so therefore it's bad. So once you can break that little curse, which is, once again, religious fanaticism is a type of suppression of knowledge. No, you can't go thinking that. Don't go there. Naughty. The devil will get you there. It's like, nah, not really. I mean, maybe, but we can think for ourselves. And a Galdramada is, or Galdrasmithir, is somebody who smiths, who creates magic through song and spells. Because of this, the Aesir are called Galdrasmithir. Odin knew and practiced himself the art which is accompanied by greatest power, called Seithr, and here in brackets, black magic, which is a typical, Christianized way to categorize this, to see it as evil. And there's reasons why they thought that. I mean, this is not all white magic. This is, some of the stuff in here is pretty dark. And that, sorry to keep saying this, but it's another subject. But in warfare, we think that it's quite okay to pierce somebody with an arrow, a spear, a bullet, a sword, an axe. But using psychic abilities is just wrong. Well, is it? I don't know. I've never really got into that side of things, even though I do have some level of these powers. I don't have any urge to use it even against people that I actually hate. And there is some people like that. I was warned by one of my Chinese kung fu sifus that a Chinese consider if you get into using dark magic or using your abilities for bad things, it rebounds on you. So I'm a bit of a chicken. I don't want anything rebounding on me. But this is, it's through the Viking stories that these things were practiced. And it says, using this ability, Seithr, he could predict the fates of men and things that had not yet happened, and also cause men death or disaster or disease, and also take the wits, the sanity or strength, physical or mental, from some and give it to others, which is a bit of a strange concept, isn't it? Do you remember that series called Heroes? I don't know how many years ago that was, but it was about these teenagers, essentially. There was this girl called Cheerleader who was sort of pretty much Superwoman, and all these others with very strange powers, pretty extreme, like this sort of thing. And there was some that could sort of take your powers from you. There's one guy who was like a leech that could take powers from one person and add them to his own repertoire. He actually played Spock in one of the Star Trek movies, this actor. But here we have, this is what people generally consider black magic. This magic, when it is practiced, is accompanied by such great perversion that it was not considered without shame for a man to perform it, and the skill was taught to the goddesses. But problematic, as they would say, for the modern way of thinking. But why is it okay for the girls to practice this and for the guys not? Perverted. So you've got to wonder what this is. Is it cross-dressing? Is it, becoming the other sex? Or is it maybe becoming no sex at all? Which I think is, obviously a higher level of being, because sex is sort of basic. It's extremely practical and useful, and it's fun, but what they considered perversion when they wrote this, I don't know. Perhaps it was just not being really macho. And have you ever seen The Wicker Man? Pretty scary old movie from the 70s about these pagans who live on a Scottish island, and this very straight Christian policeman turns up there and things go a bit wrong for him, but there's a lot of men dressing up as women and different things in a sort of a pagan context there. So this is all extremely interesting stuff. This is the sort of thing Joseph Campbell gets into in The Power of Myth and his Masks of God series. We always reference our own culture the way we think, and think that other people, they're the weirdos, like Japanese samurai. It's the most dangerous, fearsome people you could ever meet with their sword skills and whatever, but they dressed in really, really flowery, flowing robes, womanish robes, you'd call it from a Western point of view. They were really into poetry and dancing and things that, a lot of macho types would consider womanish. Funny enough, even the Vikings, they had this obsession with poetry, and for a long time in the West, poetry's been considered sort of effeminate. If I say, what do you do for a living, mate? Oh, I'm a poet. Okay, you know, you're a bit of a useless girly man. You know, that's some of the people that I was brought up with were really anti-poet, and I loved poetry. So this is where it gets really interesting in a practical sense. It says that Odin knew about all the treasure of the earth, where it was hidden, and he knew songs which would make the earth and cliffs and rocks and grave mounds open up before him. And with words alone he would bind those who were in them, and go in and take from there whatever he wanted. He became very famous because of these powers. His enemies feared him, but his friends trusted him and believed in his power and in him. I'm immediately put in mind of my friend Uri Geller. Now, we're not really close buddies, but I really like him, and we've communicated together by email many times over the last 25 years. I'm going to meet him. I get what I want, and I want to meet Uri one day and spend some time with him. I think he's one of the most extraordinary people who's ever lived, and I do believe his powers are absolutely real. The reason I thought of him is because he made a fortune working for mineral companies, divining where minerals were, things buried under the ground. Sounds just like the description of Odin. Odin was able to know where the treasure of the earth was, where it was hidden, and he knew songs which would make the earth and cliff and rocks and grave mounds open up before him. So I don't think Uri's ever opened up grave mounds and fought Draugr, the undead. If you know the Conan the Barbarian, the first film, Conan fights. He gets his sword from this dead king, and obviously Robert E. Howard, who wrote the Conan books, was really pretty inspired by the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and the ancient legends. But yeah, as far as I know, Uri never fought the undead, but I'd say he'd have a good crack at it. But that's what Odin, what's it talking about here, that Odin could take on those guys and take their swords and their gold. He became very famous because of these powers. His enemies feared him, but his friends trusted him and believed in his power and in him. And he taught most of his skills to his sacrificial priests. They were next to him in all law and magic. So he taught these skills to a very high level. They were next to him, they're up there with him. And these appear to be humans, like us. So this story is telling us that our ancient ancestors, and even if you're not a person of Nordic descent like me, your own ancestors had things like this. This is really common all over the world. Every continent, every group has these sort of stories, and that's another thing that's been suppressed and taught to us. As I've said, they're taught as just myths, just silly stories, great for kids, make good comics, but it's not real. That's what they want us to believe. And it says, and yet many others learned from it, and from there heathendom, or the old way, spread widely and lasted for a long time. And Snorri said it lasted right up to his time in the 1200s. And people worshipped Odin and the 12 rulers and called them their gods and believed in them long afterwards. The name Orthin comes from Odin, and people called their sons this, and from Thor's name came the names Thorir and Thorarin, which are in Tolkien, or the name is combined with other elements as in Steinthor or Huff-Thor, which I think means Sea Thor or Ocean Thor, or changed further in other ways. So that's chapter 7. And that's not the end of it. There's lots of other instances that I'll be sharing with you. My next book, which I'm just writing at the moment, it'll be called The Way of Midgard, will delve much deeper into this. And in my videos, I'll be making many more about these skills and what I think they are, what the modern understanding is of this sort of stuff. But it's sort of obvious. That very first sentence I read about Odin skipped bodies and then became a fish, a bird, an animal. That's shamanism, but it's also remote viewing. It's astral travelling. There's lots of words we use that are the same sort of thing. So I'll leave it at that. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Please tell your friends about me. I really want to grow my channel. I'm super keen to have my channel become very big and to get lots of people reading my books and get this conversation really started. If you're somebody who has a podcast, somebody's interested in me and what I'm talking about, I would love to talk to you. I'm always available for, to do interviews. So please don't hesitate to contact me. Either write to me here or get on Facebook and you can become a friend with me, David Lovegrove. Hopefully I'll see it. Or you can just join my group, Viking Superpowers, on Facebook and just mention who you are and the fact you'd like to meet me in one of the comments, and then we'll work out how to privately communicate with each other. So I'll see you later.